My name is Ruth Hacohen Pinchover. I guess I was invited because part of the things at the moment, I'm the chair of the Department of Musicology and the chair of the School of the Arts at the Hebrew University. And I wrote a book and some other articles that are related to this topic of today. My last book of 2011 is entitled The Music Libel Against the Jews. It was published by Yale University Press. Okay, so I have the honor, indeed, to chair tonight the symposium on Wagner's music, or musical religion, art, politics, and genocide. The connection between all these words and concepts is not an easy one. Certain parts of the Western world are celebrating these days the 200th anniversary of the German composer, born in 22nd May 1813 and lived through the 13th of February 1883, mainly by performing his monumental music dramas, as he called them, not operas, in many opera houses and through symposia in universities and other institutions. We have two main speakers tonight, Professor Robert Wistrich, whom you know, I'm sure, and Dr. Margaret Brearley. I will introduce them later. As I was asked, I elaborate now a bit on the themes of tonight's discussion, which will be accompanied by two musical excerpts and a few comments on their relevance to our topic. Now, the term music religion is a paraphrase on Hegel's, the German philosopher's, concept of art religion. During the 19th century, tells us the German musicologist Karl Dahlhaus, it was especially the concept of music religion was especially associated with the much revered abstract instrumental music that was sought to elevate feelings of the soul much above the mundane into the sublime sphere, replacing institutionalized or the theological sublime. And when I'm saying abstract instrumental music, you should bear in mind that this was a new concept in the 19th century. The whole idea of absolute music was something that really emerged as a concept only by then. And it's very interesting that, ironically, it was Wagner who coined this term, and himself, he shunned it because for him it was an obsolete idea that somehow it was still related to Beethoven, but the new kind of art, the art of the future, according to Wagner, was related to something much more encompassing. That was related to his idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. And he himself, the religious, worked for him in a somehow different way. First, he used religious and mythological elements in his music dramas, aiming at an apotheosis of the kind characterizing religious drama, still from the Middle Ages, medieval or otherwise. Think, for example, those of you who know some of Wagner's music or works, of those moments of colossal sacrifice in Götterdämmerung, or of the death through love or love in death of Tristan and Isolde, of the Erlösung, the redemption, through the Erlöser, the Redeemer, of Parsifal, of the end of Parsifal. All of these are very monumental and sweeping moments. Second, these apotheotic moments and the entire structure of production and performance, especially at Bayreuth, where he built his major temple of the arts, aim to create an experience verging on revelation, a totality that will leave nothing of you, the listener, spectator, outside the mytho-musical sphere, drawing you, sweeping you into these invented, enchanted, and enchanting worlds that he created. This brings us immediately to the political sphere that is also contained in tonight's title. The political emerges from this sort of experience in relation to the concept of aesthetic judgment, which Kant and the Kantian tradition viewed as so essential to artistic experience, and which involves distance and a desirable play between emotion and interpretation, experience and critical thought. In this spirit, the writer and poet Coleridge, the British writer, coined the term willing suspension of disbelief. Suspension. In the case of Wagner, we do not speak of suspension of disbelief, but of total immersion in a belief. Belief in this art, in that music, and the political contents it brings forth. Such beliefs transcend the boundaries of the work and its performance. They aspire to spill over one's entire life and Weltanschauung. Indeed, Wagner did see himself as much more than a musician, composer, or even theoretician and polemicist, and he was all these. Yeah, he was a Gesamtkunstmann, in a way. He saw himself as both prophet and priest, as well as a cultural leader, one that undertakes the mission to transport Germany and German culture into new realms, invigorating the nation as a whole and extricating it from its dull and decadent present, partially related to the fact that Jews were so prominent in that culture. The connection of all this to genocide, the Jewish one, of course, is the more problematic and a much less obvious element in this title. Famously, it is connected to the last word that ends Wagner's notorious 1850 lampoon Das Judentum in der Musik. The last word is das Untergang, which reads within the sentence das. Aber bedenkt, dass nur eines eure Erlösung vor dem auf euch lastenden Fluche sein kann, die Erlösung Ahasverus, der Untergang, in English. But think, he addresses the Jews who listens to him. There is only one sort of redemption from that curse that haunts you, the Jews. The redemption of Ahasverus. Ahasverus is, of course, the wandering Jew. How is this redemption is taking place? This is the major question, of course. And this is the point of much controversy, whether this word means downfall, decline, setting, sinking, or rather actual eradication, that is genocide. I will not enter into this. I only mention here that, would like to mention that the much esteemed Hebrew University late historian Yaakov Katz interpreted this sentence unequivocally as Wagner's call for assimilation or acculturation rather than extermination. Personally, I accept this reading, which textually and contextually makes much sense. This last sentence is connected with another important query that preoccupies many scholars and thinkers. Is Wagner's music a liberating art or an oppressive one? This is a question that should be posited again and again for both the admirers of Richard Wagner and those who are less so. It is here that I invite you to taste a Wagnerian moment, one that I chose, and I chose not to name, identify it at the moment before you listen to it, because I want your listening to be as free as possible. Of course, you know that this is Wagner. And letting you imagine to what and where it could connect. We cannot discuss it, but just play with yourself, with your imagination, while you listen to it. And I will... we have to press this, if you can do it for me. Oh, no, sorry. Just press it for me. repeats all over again. This is a very Wagnerian procedure, this repetition. Just after this, I will tell you, it sounds very tragic. But there is a missing point here. I'm sorry, there's a kind of a bit of a technical problem, but we're supposed to hear now is a melody played by an English horn. English horn, and it goes like Ti-da-da-dee-ti-da-da. After this, ta-dee-da-dum, ta-da, ta-dee-pa-dum, pa-da-da-dee-dum, ti-dee-dee-dee-dum, pa-da-da-dee-dum, pa-da-da-dee-da-da-da-da. And you hear it over and over again after this opening. It is a melody. It's the opening of the third act of Tristan and Isolde. This is what we call, this melody that you hear, that I sang, is what we call real or diegetic music. It is actually, as I said, performed by the English horn, but within the fictional sphere, it is played by a shepherd up on the hill in Brittany, where someone listens to it in a rather peculiar way. His name is Tristan. He stays in a sort of delirium. Seriously wounded, he hears it from within his dimming consciousness. It is tempting to interpret the whole process he goes through in the first part of this final act in psychoanalytic terms, and as such it was understood in the 1950s. He does work through his past experience during long moments in which this real music from his early childhood is heard again and again fragmented. The shepherd is playing and he's hearing the melody again and again. This alte Weise, this is how it is called by Wagner, it floods him with memories, shaking his entire being, conjuring up his past, his parents, and the immediate present. And with all of this, his Isolde. Alte Weise, old tune. What it tells me, what old melodies taken from the folklore, from the very substance of one's deep recesses of collective culture, What do they tell us? Also, Jews ask the very same question on Alte Weise. That's how they call the Nusach, הנוסח ששרים בבית הכנסת, כן? The synagogue recitative. The same synagogue that recitative or melodies which Wagner ridiculed so maliciously in the above-mentioned Lampoon. Now, this is one of the paradoxes of this story of Wagner. Both Wagner and the Jews, as part of the same spirit of nationalism, which were everywhere in the 19th century, were trying to capture that Volksgeist, to find its deep roots and draw from it the spiritual impetus necessary for various resurrection enterprises. No wonder why Herzl found so much inspiration in Wagner's work, especially Tannhäuser. Tristan and Isolde apparently are innocent. Both the Tristan and Isolde as figures as well as the work as work is innocent. They are not connected to any, apparently, national project. And yet their aspiration to total simultaneity, Tristan and Isolde, that which eradicates the individual in a grand symbiosis, transcending life and reality, is something which Wagner was obsessed with in variety of ways. And thus he conceived of another such moment when it becomes the preoccupation of the whole nation. And there the question is whether the right melody can still be brought about. And what it does. And it does. When it does, this melody is being brought about. And it does, the people are elevated, redeemed. The Meistersinger von Nuremberg, premiered in 1868, 3 years after Tristan and Isolde, terminates with the following well-known text carried by the entire Nuremberg people. And please, if you can go to the next. Yeah? Daphna? Okay. Yeah. This is Tristan and Isolde, as you see, the old German, English, British medieval story on which Wagner built his opera. And the second one, next one, please. This is the Meistersinger from the first act of this opera, drawing a picture from Wagner's time. And the next one, when you see, and I'll read here only the English text, honor your German masters, then will you conjure up good spirits, and if you favor their endeavors, even should the Holy Roman Empire dissolve in mist, for us there would yet remain Holy German art. Now, of course, this has more than double meaning. What is Holy German art? What is this dissolving of the empire? Maybe we will come to this later in the discussion. We will have a discussion of about half an hour, which will start about 8 o'clock. For the moment, I suggest that we will watch together this festive moment, just for 2-3 minutes, in the fictive late medieval Nuremberg, with all its pomposity and euphoria, however innocent as it was, as it appeared in 1868. Now, these Meistersingers, they are those who are able to create this sort of music, this sort of song, and this song is that which revives the entire community of the Bürger, the German citizens in that late medieval city. And of course, it is a symbol of what should be taking place in Germany of the late 19th century. And you just see it and have it in mind for what we are going to discuss later on. So if you can. Subtitles? Shh. Chazak. this is, of course, the master singer, the new master singer, whose name is Walter von Scholzing. He succeeded in this competition, and with this success, everybody feels that there is a sort of redemption to this community, the reason of which I will not elaborate on now. But I would like to finish at this point and just to point again to the connection, how important melody is in creating this simultaneity of minds, which is so important for the redemption of the whole community. And maybe we'll come to this, back to this later on. Now I stop my kind of speech that I was asked to give in order to switch to my task as a mediator, as a chairperson of this gathering, of this symposium. And I'm very glad to introduce before you and Dr. Margaret Brearley, who visited us many times in the past already. Dr. Margaret Brearley studied modern and medieval languages at Oxford, Cambridge, and Münster, Germany. For many years, she lectured in medieval and Renaissance German literature and history. And, sorry, there is a problem here. I'm sorry to tell you. For 6 years, she lectures something. There is a problem in the text. I cannot read it well. University of Birmingham in the Center of Judaism and Jewish-Christian Relations at the Selly Oak Theological. I'm sorry. There is a problem in the text. I asked you, somebody will fix it for me. I'm very sorry, but maybe, Robert, you will, since you know Margaret better than I, if you can say by heart things, because of the, I guess that what happens, you know, all of you, what happens when we are switching from Hebrew to English, that's what takes place in the lines. That's what happened here, and I asked that it will be fixed, and it was not, and so I'm sorry. I'm not able to read it and to create sentences which will be coherent. Would you like me to take? Yeah, sure.
I think Margaret.
But it will be, Margaret, it will be without, I'm sorry, but it will be without the superlatives, without the awards, and because I'm sure that Margaret is the oldest person, it will not tell you. So you should complete it in your imagination. So, yes.
Oh, well,
you did. I'm just before that, if you will come with me.
Fine, you don't need any more details about my life. It's much more important to hear about Richard Wagner. Let me begin by a quote, famous quote from Woody Allen. I can't listen to that much Wagner. I start getting the urge to conquer Poland. The critic Edward Hanslick wrote of Wagner in middle age, he was then a man and not a god, as he has been since the Bayreuth ascent into heaven. Richard Wagner was one of the greatest operas ever. Composers ever. His 10 major music dramas are superbly orchestrated and uniquely powerful. He was immensely innovative and exerted overwhelming influence on later composers. Many who encounter Wagner's music experience something so heart-stopping that it feels like a life-changing conversion, a religious revelation. Exceptional individuals on whom Wagner's music made such an impact include Nietzsche, Thomas Mann, Herzl, Goebbels, and Hitler. All modern culture is, in a sense, post-Wagnerian. His influence extended to the theatre and psychology, poetry, and the arts. Freud, Jung, Mallarmé, Baudelaire, Manet, Proust, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot are among the many creative minds he touched. Wagner, although an autodidact, was a thinker. He wrote 10 volumes of prose about music, his political views, and aesthetic vision. This is just one of them. They illuminate the meaning of his music dramas and, from the 1870s onwards, influenced German thought. I shall quote frequently from them. Wagner was truly revolutionary in music and in politics. Theoretically a communist, he belonged to the radical Jungdeutschland movement. He actively took part in the 1849 Dresden Uprising alongside his friend, the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. When the uprising failed, Wagner fled into exile. Although few revolutionaries ever spent so lavishly or depended so much on wealthy benefactors as Wagner, he remained a committed radical. He wrote to his long-suffering wife in 1850, "A true victorious revolutionary must act in total disregard for others. He must not think of his wife and child. His single aim is annihilation." Wagner wrote to Liszt soon after, "I have no money, but a tremendous desire to practice some artistic terrorism." In 1851, he described his own radical politics as nothing more than the bloodiest hatred of our entire civilization, contempt for everything in it that stems from it, and yearning for nature. Only the most terrifying and most destructive revolution can make out of our civilized beasts humans again. Between 1848 and 1851, Wagner conceived a new way of creating destructive revolution through what he called his artwork of the future, his lifetime's großes Werk, great project. The artwork of the future eventually comprised the Ring Cycle, begun in 1851, performed 1876, Tristan, 1865, the Meistersinger of Nuremberg, 1868, and Parsifal, 1882. Wagner planned a revolution through, I quote from 1849, a new religion, the religion which contains within itself the conditions of the artwork of the future. For Wagner, revolution itself was religious. Just before the Dresden Uprising, he spoke of the lofty goddess revolution as a supernatural force. For many German thinkers, traditional religion had been devastated by Hegel's philosophy. This had, according to Engels, destroyed all theories of absolute truth. In face of it, nothing final, absolute, or sacred exists. David Strauss's 1835 Life of Jesus had stripped Jesus of divinity. Feuerbach argued in 1841 that Christianity is no more than a fixed idea. Christianity has long vanished from the life of mankind. In 1844, Max Stirner, in his radical book, The Ego and Its Own, mocked German idealists who yearned for a new religion, a new torment, a new devotion, a new deity. For Stirner, everything sacred is a tie, a fetter. He rejected the temptation to proclaim a new religion and championed extreme individualism. The people is dead, up with me. Wagner disagreed. He did proclaim a new religion. He believed himself, as Ruth mentioned, to have a mission, a task as prophet. In Judaism in Music, 1850, probably written in 1848, he wrote, "The true poet is the prophet who reveals the future. Only the deepest, most soulful sympathy makes one capable of such a prophetic task." Modern Germany, he believed, needed a prophet with deepest sympathy because it was corrupted by foreign influences. Long before, in 1808, in French-occupied Germany under Napoleon, the philosopher Fichte had uttered the prophecy of a new life. In Fichte's addresses to the German nation, he attacked foreign influence from the French, a people of a lower species, and rallied the German spirit. Fichte demanded the complete and thorough regeneration of our race. His solution was to adopt the education system of Pestalozzi, to develop a new spirituality, and for Germans to begin the new era as pioneers and models for the rest of mankind. Wagner's solution was somewhat Fichtean. It was through spirituality, a new spirituality, and above all, liberation through his opera. Opera with its own new spirituality. I quote him, "Opera, as liberator of the world, must rule religion." Wagner's new spirituality was in fact very old. He planned to resurrect the essence of Greek paganism within modern Germany. Wagner was steeped in classical Greek literature and mythology and idealized ancient Greece. He argued that Greeks had been one with nature and their own natural instincts. In worshipping gods, they actually worshipped themselves, because gods were simply Greek heroes writ large. Ancient Greeks had known themselves to be divine. They had reveled in eros, artistic creativity, fearlessness, and life. But Greek beauty, Greek art, and freedom had been destroyed by alien values, by the slave morality of Judaism and Christianity. The Jewish God, I quote Wagner, absolute and superhuman, had imposed the Ten Commandments and conscience. He had, quote, imprisoned man in a loathsome dungeon. As Wagner wrote, thenceforth God, Jehovah, ruled the world. From that time forward, man's affairs are governed by the incomprehensible will of God, no longer by the instinct and necessity of nature. Christianity, he argued, knew only guilt, lovelessness, fear, and death. Uprooted from nature, Christianity couldn't create true art. European races became decadent except for the Teutons and their German descendants. In the German folk alone, despite centuries-long oppression by the Roman Catholic Church, a spark of divine paganism still survived. The Germans alone retained the elementary nature gods, according to Wagner, who claimed that when Germans worshipped God, they actually still worshipped Wotan or Woden. When Germans worshipped Christ, they actually worshipped their inner god, the sun god Apollo, known as Siegfried. I quote Wagner, "In the German folk, the oldest lawful race of kings in the whole world survives. It springs from a son of God, whom his nearest kinsmen call Siegfried, and the other nations Christ." Wagner naturally rejected Christian dogma. He called Christianity, which denied human instincts, that deepest hell, that deepest unredeemable hell of restless egoism. Initially, in his prose sketch Jesus of Nazareth, 1848, Wagner used the trappings of Christianity to teach his revolutionary spirituality, as he did at the end of his life in Parsifal. His Jesus rejected Christian ethics, declaring that now there is no more sin. Loveless marriage is a sin, whereas any kind of love is sinless. Love is greater than the law. Indeed, love is the only law. Jesus affirms eros. Let your body do according to the heart. Jesus even teaches that we humans are God himself, for God is knowledge of the self. Wagner's radical quasi-Christianity is in keeping with Feuerbach's teachings, 1842, God is in truth only man's own essence. Therefore, the turning point of the world's history is that from now on, no longer God, but man is to appear to man as God. Wagner's Jesus declared, "We are God himself. The only God indwells us and in our unity with nature." Thus Wagner taught the conscious reunion of nature with man. But how to reunite Germans, both with each other and with their natural instincts? Why? By reawakening what Wagner called an instinct lost to the German nation, a German instinct, our natural repugnance against the Jew, this freak of nature. This is how Wagner described anti-Semitism. In Judaism and music, Wagner affirmed, quote, deep-rooted dislike of the Jewish nature, that unconscious feeling, that involuntary repellence. Liberation from Jews was necessary, Wagner argued, because in his day, newly emancipated Jews were attacking Germany again, using their commerce and money to undermine the German folk. Wagner led the counterattack against Jews by writing Judaism in music, published anonymously in 1850 and under his own name in 1869. Now, anti-Judaism was normative among German nationalists and radicals from Fichte onwards. The philosopher Jacob Fries had called in 1816 for the extermination of this Jewish commercial class. Even Jewish socialists such as Ludwig Börner and Heinrich Heine expressed deep anti-Judaism in the 1820s and 30s. The novelist Karl Gutzkow saw Jews as a living corpse and obsolescent. He argued in 1842 that Jews had committed a crime against humanity. They displayed lovelessness and the irredeemable vice of egoism, and he demanded their self-destruction. Now, Gutzkow was, together with Heinrich Lauber, founder of Jung Deutschland, to which Wagner belonged. Gutzkow's anti-Semitism was, in Paul Rose's words, typical of the young German revolutionary outlook. Wagner was a close friend of Heinrich Lauber from 1830 and a close colleague of Gutzkow's in Dresden in 1847. He shared the anti-Semitism of Gutzkow, Lauber, and Bakunin. Like Gutzkow, Wagner used the figure of Ahasuerus the Wandering Jew to demand the Untergang, whatever that means, destruction, of the Jews. Like Lauber, Wagner depicted Jews as aliens, hostile, un-German. He called for a war of liberation from Jews, whom he called the most heartless of human beings. Quote, emancipation from the yoke of Judaism appears to us the greatest of necessities. I quote, I hold the Jewish race to be the born enemy of humanity and everything noble in it. It is certain that it is running us Germans to the ground, and I am perhaps the last German who knows how to hold himself upright in the face of Judaism, which already rules everything. But while Wagner, like other young Germans, attacked Jews through words, he went far further. For uniquely, Wagner created a musical religion as a weapon against Judaism. His musical religion would replace Judeo-Christianity, and it would awaken and redeem Germany to become the redeemer of Europe. He would stretch out the essence of Hellenic Greek religion, I quote, until its folds embraced the religion of the future, the religion of universal manhood, the great and glorious artwork of the future, his own music, is the living presentation of religion. Because, he wrote, religions spring not from the artist's brain, their only origin is in the folk, Wagner could claim that his music, his musical religion, was deeply German, coming from the folk. Cosima Wagner later affirmed the religious nature of Wagner's music. Of the greatest German composers, Beethoven was music made human, Mozart embodied the natural world of flora and fauna, and Richard Wagner, in Cosima's words, embodied religion. Quote, Wagner's religion to this whole is as revelation as religion. Now I wish here to suggest a long overlooked source for Wagner's unprecedented musical religion, the writings of the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini founded in 1832 the radical journal Young Italy, and in 1834 the revolutionary movement of Young Europe. Because in 1834 Mazzini also founded Jung Deutschland, Young Germany, possibly with Wagner's friend Heinrich Laube, Wagner would have known of him. 2 years later, in 1836, Mazzini published a philosophy of music in which he called for a new music, a European music, the art of the future and the music of the future. I quote Mazzini, music must be reconsecrated to a sacred mission. Music is the fragrance of the universe. The sole idiom common to all nations, music is a harmony of creation, an echo of the invisible world, a note in the divine chord that the whole universe will be called upon someday to express. Mazzini urged that music should be used for regeneration. Opera, above all, should be preeminent, becoming in his term musical drama, the term Wagner adopted. Opera should stop being fragmentary, a series of arias, duets, choruses, and become a coherent whole. Recitative should be as important as melody. Repeated musical phrases or chords should characterize moods or personages on stage. The chorus, so dominant in Greek drama, could be used to restore unity. I suggest that Wagner's music from the mid-1840s, and especially from the Ring onwards, reflected and developed Mazzini's theories. 3 likely examples of Mazzini's influence are Wagner's extensive use of leitmotifs, the preponderance of recitative in his music dramas, and his use of the orchestra to create unity. Wagner argued that the Greek chorus is the orchestra. The prolonged opening chords at the beginning of the Ring in Rheingold, 136 bars and 4 minutes long, and the opening chord at the beginning of Tristan, do they perhaps evoke Mazzini's divine chord of the universe? Above all, Wagner's seductive music was consecrated to a sacred mission, though a highly unorthodox one. Wagner's music, from the Ring onwards, has hidden depths, hidden meanings. There are many layers of meanings: anti-capitalist, psychological, erotic, political, mythological, aesthetic, and more. In this depth of multiple meanings lies one source of Wagner's attacks on the brilliant Jewish composer Meyerbeer. Wagner's opposition to Meyerbeer went far deeper than aesthetics, envy, or anti-Semitism. Wagner attacked Meyerbeer's, quote, emptiness, shallowness, and artistic nothingness, his utmost spiritual penury. Meyerbeer's heroes were simply costumed tenors, uninspired and uninspiring. A Wagnerian hero, by contrast, is, quote Wagner, inspired, singing from very ecstasy. Lohengrin, Siegmund, Tristan, these are heroes, deep and magnified almost to be gods. Wagner's Ring Cycle abandoned the medieval Christian world of Tannhäuser and Lohengrin in favor of pagan German and Nordic mythology. Wagner was awakening the German spirit, using, as it were, the pagan gods of Germany's own soil and pre-Christian heroic past. In The Ring, Wagner presented Germans with their primeval myth and summoned them to political power. He wrote that the Nibelungen gold symbolized the secret of all earthly power, political power. The hero god Siegfried, who captured this gold, bequeathed to the German folk this power to rule. Now, for those of you who don't know it, I just briefly mentioned the Ring Cycle presents Siegfried as the German pagan Christ Apollo, instinct-driven, remorseless, supremely free. Siegfried symbolically restores German power. He gains the Nibelungen gold by murdering the giant Fafner. Tasting Fafner's blood enables Siegfried to understand the woodbird's song, which is the voice of nature. Nature first directs him to the gold, which will make Siegfried the ruler of the world, so says nature. Later, nature approves of Siegfried's murder of the malign dwarf Mime, who represents, as I argue along with Gustav Mahler, Theodor Adorno and others, unnatural Jews and Judaism. Finally, nature, in the woodbird, demands fearlessness and directs Siegfried towards the sleeping Brunhilde. Siegfried awakens Brunhilde. In this act, Eros awakens womanhood, poetry awakens music. Above all, Germany's pagan Christ awakens the German sleeping folk. But Siegfried is murdered by Hagen, Mime's malevolent half-brother. While Dieter Bochmeier and other critics deny any trace of Jewishness in Hagen or Mime, or indeed in Beckmesser, Kundry or Klingsor, I agree with Mark Weiner, Hartmut Zielinski, and numerous others who see them as caricature epitomes of the Jewishness excoriated in Judaism in music. If we are right, then one message of The Ring is vengeance against Jews of Wagner's day. I quote Wagner, Siegfried too is slain. As a sacrifice to his deed of blessing us, he wakes the moral motive of revenge. That is, the longing to avenge his death upon his murderer and thus renew the deed. The old fight is now continued by ourselves. In Siegfried was found the striking likeness to Christ himself, in that he too died, was mourned and avenged, as we still avenge Christ on the Jews of today. Theodor Adorno noted that Wagner's use of harmony was deeply ambiguous. Wagner's religion, too, was deeply ambiguous and eclectic. He must have encountered Hinduism and Buddhism long before his famed reading of Schopenhauer in 1854. He had two brothers who were called Brockhaus from the publishing firm. One had studied with August Wilhelm von Schlegel, the founder of German Indology. From 1842, this Brockhaus taught ancient literature at Leipzig, where Wagner visited him occasionally to dine, to borrow money, or to stay. Brockhaus edited Indian tales and plays imbued with Buddhism and Hinduism, which Wagner, passionate about mythology, must have discussed with him in the 1840s. So when he encountered Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy, which sought to uproot Christianity from Judaism and reroute it into Buddhism, Wagner had a shock of joyful recognition. He later argued that reading Schopenhauer overturned his Greek cheerful view of life. He rewrote in 1856 Brunhilde's joyfully erotic farewell to the dead Siegfried at the end of The Ring, and introduced disguised Buddhist concepts such as nirvana, Maya, illusion, and renunciation of the will, which Schopenhauer defines as the unconscious sexual drive. But while Tristan retains Buddhist themes and vocabulary, Eros is not renounced. Wagner remained fascinated by Buddhism until his death, and his Tristan is imbued with Eros despite the Buddhism. Tristan music is ultra-erotic. Its intense chromaticism and endlessly delayed resolutions express endless orgasmic desire. In Tristan, it is sexual love itself that annihilates the will. Wagner wrote to his revolutionary friend Röckel in 1855 that, by accepting the profound truths of Schopenhauer's teaching, I was able to follow my own inner bent. Indeed, he claimed that no one has penetrated into the spirit of Schopenhauer's philosophy more than I. Schopenhauer wrote that, this is a bit difficult, so listen, if one removes space and time, there are no insuperable barriers to the communication of thoughts and the direct imposition of the will. Thus, changes are produced merely by an act of will intensified beyond the individual. So an individual like Wagner can influence people by destroying time and space and by his intense willpower. Did Wagner famously turn time into space and blur space itself in Parsifal in order to impose his will on his audience and through them on Germany? I believe so. Wagner left much unsaid. He often remained opaque. He wrote in the late 1840s, "I am without antecedents in the history of art, and I truly aimed at a goal which no one saw." Whenever he spoke of his goal, he was oblique. He wrote in 1852 of the victorious goal of our salvation warfare. In 1875, writing to King Ludwig II about the Bayreuth singers for the future ring, he wrote, "I must willingly leave these deceived. If I truly revealed my goal to them, they would all become alarmed." Even in letters to his confidante Mathilde Wesendonck, Wagner used veiled allusions. In a certain very deep sense, understandable only to the world spirit, I can in new works only repeat myself, I can reveal no different intrinsic essence. What is certain is that Wagner's religion is both pagan and Hellenic, mysterious and esoteric. He attacked the Christian spirit for being unnatural, the thing poured out upon us from above. He wrote that his spirit is that which pours itself out from us, just as the perfume which pours itself out from the flower. His spirit comes directly from the human unconscious. Wagner wrote of himself, "The poet is the knower of the unconscious." His fascination with the unconscious shows how abreast he was of current thinking. He may well have read von Schubert's The Symbolism of Dream, republished by Brockhaus in 1837, and Carl Gustav Karus's Psyche, 1846, a groundbreaking study of different levels of the unconscious. So, as he intended to restore Germans back to instinct and the activity of nature, which he regarded as the unconscious, Wagner needed to kindle their unconscious. He developed a musical language which explored the unconscious to an unprecedented degree. His music is so powerful, partly because it acts subliminally. It penetrates the audience's unconscious. Wagner wrote to Hans von Bülow that he wanted the listener to give himself unresistingly to his music, so that the listener involuntarily assimilates even what is most alien to his nature. Wagner used his kaleidoscope of light motifs, over 90 in the Ring alone, to permeate the music with symbols whose meaning works on our unconscious. Critic Robert Donington noted, "We are conscious of the symbols. We may not be in the rational sense conscious of their meaning, though their meaning is through our intuition." Wagner used the orchestra to be what he called the sea of feeling. The audience's own feelings towards or against key characters or events are subtly manipulated by orchestral devices, the use of staccato rhythms, the timbre of instruments, harsh dissonances, or sweetest melodies. Wagnerian heroes, too, act from feeling, not reason. They act intuitively, instinctively. This gives them their power. Wagner wrote that a hero obeys his inner God. He takes counsel of the God within him. His voice penetrates the inmost marrow of the people so powerfully that the folk too becomes semi-divine. The folk itself grows conscious of the God within them and rise up, inspired to fight the foe, to die or conquer. Now, the God within, what does that actually mean? Is it simply a typical romantic cliché expressing the powerful poetic muse? Is it simply Feuerbach's vision of the infinity of man's nature? Or does it perhaps represent something darker, far more powerful, unleashed deliberately from the unconscious? Fascinatingly, the discovery was made precisely during the 1940s that hashish can create a state of intoxication so intense that man feels briefly divine. From 1845 until 1850, the Assassins' Club met regularly in Paris to test the effects on themselves of large doses of pure hashish administered by Dr. Moreau. The Assassins' Club comprised a dozen or so artists, musicians, and poets, including Charles Baudelaire, Gérard de Novelle, and Gérard de Nerval, and Théophile Gautier. A few seers attended, who did not take hashish but recorded its effects on the other members. In 1851, Baudelaire published Wine and Hashish, in which he noted the extraordinary results of hash. They included not only hallucinations, but absolute happiness, an implacable ecstasy in which time completely disappears, personality vanishes, and music creates infinite poems of imagery. Significantly, each hashish taker experiences, I quote Baudelaire, a sense of divinity in himself. Man is a god. Something within you is saying, you are superior to all men. Wagner spent time in Paris in 1849 and 1850. He may have met Gautier, Baudelaire, or de Nerval, who were all friends of Liszt. Wagner may well have learnt of hashish as an artificial means of achieving divinity. Nietzsche wrote of Lohengrin. Wagner knows the effects of opiates and narcotics. Wagner certainly did know of Beethoven's divine spark. In 1839, Bettina Brentano von Arnim published her conversations with Beethoven, who had declared, "God is nearer to me than others. I commune with him. I have always understood him. Art represents divinity. Music is the electric soil in which the spirit lives, thinks, invents. I am of electric nature." In Wagner's own essay on Beethoven, written in 1870, he noted that, quote, "Beethoven was aware of his oneness with divinity." So was Wagner. Wagner, too, felt such an inner divinity, at times experiencing, in his words, universal currents of divine thought, universal vibrating energy, the supreme force of the universe, in that trance-like condition, which is the prerequisite of all true creative effort. I feel that I am one with this vibrating force. Perceptive friends such as Malvida von Meisenbuch wrote of Wagner's powerful daemon. Socrates too had one. In many listeners, Wagner's music creates unparalleled ecstasy. Wagner promised ecstasy to wise men, above all to Germans, who would become, through his music dramas, blissful men, knowers of the unconscious, willing their instincts. They would be redeemed into community, unity, and nature. Wagner developed unparalleled harmonic and orchestral techniques to create hypnotic music, which gives, in Adorno's words, a sense of floating. As the philosopher Roger Scruton recently wrote, the very form of Wagner's music drama is a permanent invitation to intoxication as a form of oceanic regression. No other music had been so intoxicatingly erotic, none has been since. Lawrence Dreyfus's recent study of Wagner and the erotic impulse brilliantly explores what he calls Wagner's obsession with sex. Dreyfus shows how in many listeners, quote, Wagner's erotics sparked a quasi-religious conversion. The conductor Bruno Walter was typical, writing that Tristan transported him in holy bliss, in ecstasy. My life had changed, a new epoch had begun. Wagner was my God, and I wanted to become his prophet. Wagner's music entwined sensuality with spirituality. Baudelaire noted in 1861 the sensation of spiritual and physical bliss. This bliss is achieved both by Wagner's orchestration and also by his extraordinary emphasis on feeling. We must become knowers through the feeling. he sought consciously to bypass reason in order to reach the instincts and unconscious of the audience. I quote him, "The obsolete intelligence which has led the folk in chains must be completely annihilated. We must all know that we must yield ourselves, not to our intelligence, but to the necessity of nature. Then, when we have become brave enough to deny our intellect, natural unconsciousness will gain the force to produce the new." Wagner's arcane spirituality offered more than dark, irrational ecstasy. It promised redemption. For Wagner, music was the highest, the redeeming art. He envisaged redemption, and this redemption included liberation from Jews. Redemption from Jews. Only with our redemption into genuine manhood will the Jew find redemption, which means firstly for the Jew ceasing to be a Jew. The Jew's task is the regenerative task of deliverance through self-annulment. It is in Parsifal, first performed in Bayreuth, 1882, that Wagner fully reveals the religion of redemption, first glimpsed in the Ring. The Nibelung ring of power is reincarnated in the Grail. Siegfried's sword, Notung, is reincarnated in Parsifal's Grail lance, and the murdered Siegfried is, as it were, reincarnated in the hero Parsifal. Siegfried had been a partial redeemer, foiled by murder. Parsifal becomes the pure, perfect redeemer. Christian trappings of Grail and Good Friday mask a mysticism of purified Aryan blood and Buddhist renunciation. Long before 1882, Wagner had adopted the racist teachings of Arthur Gobineau. Wagner's Aryanism is, unlike that of Gobineau, deeply anti-Semitic. Wagner argued that as Christ was not a Jew, his blood of suffering mankind was shed for the noblest cleansing of man's blood from every stain, meaning every racial stain, in order to raise the very lowest races to the purity of gods. This would have been the antidote to the decline of races through racial commingling. The Church had been entrusted with Christ's blood, in the Eucharistic blood, but it had let it be tainted by Judaism, just as the hero blood of noblest races was now tainted with the blood of Jews, whom Wagner called the former cannibals now trained to be the business agents of society. So Parsifal is an utterly Aryan redeemer whose mission is to purify the tainted Eucharistic blood in the Grail chalice by destroying the magician Klingsor and spurning the kiss of seductive Kundry, whom Wagner at one point specifies is a wandering Jewess. Kundry is then desouled, extinguished in death, just as Parsifal's phallic lance awakens the womb-like Grail, purifying its blood. Wagner called Parsifal his holiest work, an exaltation of the world's inmost soul, prophesying redemption, the image of a prophetic dream. The dream prophesies redemption from Jews, whom he called the plastic demon of man's downfall. Wagner hoped in vain that Ludwig II of Bavaria, whom he called my Parsifal, would fulfill his dream at his Munich court. One dream, however, was fulfilled. Already in 1851, Wagner had envisaged, as Ruth mentioned, creating a permanent shrine for his musical religion. Some 20 years later, Bayreuth became a temple, a place of pilgrimage for the Ring and Parsifal. Parsifal was designated Bühnenweihfestspiel, festival play to consecrate the stage. Wagner designed the festival theatre to be as like a Greek amphitheatre as possible. Key innovations included a darkened auditorium and a unique acoustic, enhancing its quasi-mystical effect. As in Greek religious festivals in Athens called the Dionysia, performances of the Ring comprise 4 parts and last 4 days. Bayreuth performances were designed to be subconsciously religious. The hidden orchestra, the extraordinary stage effects, and overwhelmingly powerful, intoxicating music were designed to achieve almost an altered consciousness in the audience, akin to a hallucinatory drug. The radical thinker Saint-Simon, who influenced both Liszt and Wagner, had pleaded for the artist to be a priest figure. Wagner described himself as 1880 as poet-priest, a term that he meant, I think, absolutely seriously. And interestingly, in letters long before, written by him or under his direction his first wife, begging for money, the term sacrifice was commonly used. A priest, after all, expects sacrifices. Certainly Liszt, who was initiated more than most into Wagner's inner world, understood Wagner as priest unlocking the secret Grail temple. The Prelude to Lohengrin has been called the first example of hypnotism by music. In 1851, Liszt wrote that the Prelude to Lohengrin reveals, I quote, "the mystic element always hidden in the piece, the divine secret, the supernatural force. To teach us the unrepresentable power of this secret, Wagner shows us the ineffable beauty of the sanctuary, inhabited by a God who avenges the oppressed and asks nothing but love and faith from his worshippers. Wagner initiates us into the Holy Grail. He causes to shimmer before our eyes the temple, with fragrant walls and doors of gold." If Wagner did believe himself a poet-priest, then whose priest was he? In 1849, Wagner wrote that in ancient Greek tragedy, the glorious god Apollo, who was the very essence of the Greeks themselves, stood revealed by the poet. I quote, "A tragedy day was a feast of the god, for here the god spoke clearly, and the poet, as his high priest, stood real and embodied in his artwork, and proclaimed the utterances of godlike wisdom. But it was the god Dionysus who brought the vision of Apollo." I quote Wagner, "Inspired by Dionysus, the tragic poet saw the god." According to Bettina von Arnim, Beethoven declared, "Music is the wine and I am the Bacchus." For Beethoven, this was doubtless metaphor. But in 1872, when still Wagner's disciple, Nietzsche argued in The Birth of Tragedy out of the Spirit of Music that Wagner's music is Dionysiac. Nietzsche believed that Wagner's music actually mediated Bacchus Dionysus, invoking Dionysus into Germany as the German spirit, the new German spirit, and unleashing new power. I quote Nietzsche, "Out of the Dionysian foundation of the German spirit is arising a force, a daemon arising from unfathomable depths." The music of Tristan, above all, creates a Dionysiac ecstasy so powerful that it destroys all boundaries, all sense of self through, in Nietzsche's words, joy in the annihilation of the individual. The gulfs between man and man give way to an overpowering feeling of unity which leads back to the heart of nature. The Dionysus of antiquity was the suffering, dying, and redeeming god. He was god of intoxication and wine, eros, death, and importantly, Dionysus was the god of theatre. Fascinatingly, opium may have been used to create visions in the Eleusinian rites of Dionysus. Wagner knew the writings of Karl Ottfried Müller, who wrote in 1830, "Nature overpowering the mind and hurrying it out of a clear self-consciousness lies at the base of all Dionysian creations." In 1933, Walter Otto emphasized Dionysus as the god of ecstasy and terror. He noted the unparalleled horror of the epithets describing Dionysus, who embodied a savagery which is absolutely without mercy. I'm just going to read just a few moments about Dionysus because it's important for my last point. We're nearly there. To remind you, Zeus's son Dionysus was known from Euripides the Bacchae as the god of joy, the unexpected god, creator of madness and maddening trance, and above all, a god of terror irresistible. Conceived in fire, the child Dionysus was dismembered, cooked and eaten by the giant Titans. Only his heart, which was actually his phallus, his male organ, survived. In the myth reenacted in the Bacchae, Dionysus destroyed his own cousin, Pentheus, because Pentheus refused to recognize Dionysus as god. Dionysus first destroyed Pentheus' palace by fire, and then lured Pentheus to a violent death at the hands of his own mother, who tore her son apart in frenzied madness induced by Dionysus. On eventually recognizing her murder of her son, Agawi was appalled at the evil she had committed through frenzy when possessed by Dionysus. In real life, the followers of Dionysus, mainly female maenads, reenacted Dionysus myths. They resurrected him annually by reenacting a holy open secret. In orgiastic ceremonies, they sexually reawakened his symbolic heart, really a phallus lying in a basket. They ecstatically tore living animals and occasionally human beings, limb from limb, drinking their blood as a sacrifice. This was one aspect of Greek Dionysian worship. The Athenian 4-day Dionysia were the other. Now, the Romantic movement, pre-Wagner, had identified with Dionysus. For the German poet Hölderlin, Dionysus was precursor of Christ. Schelling and Schlegel, Kreutzer and Karl Gottfried Müller all discussed Dionysus at length. For Shelley and others, Dionysus symbolized man's inner self, creating while inspired or intoxicated. Did Wagner, perhaps, conceive of his own inner daemon as Dionysus? Did he conceive himself as the poet-priest of Dionysus? This startling idea, which I don't think anybody else is suggesting, is worth considering. For given that one task of any priest is imitatio Dei, imitation of the god, it is striking that Wagner's own life embodied markedly Dionysiac elements. At the Athens Dionysia, the throne or altar of Dionysus was positioned centrally, exactly where Wagner placed himself for the first time as conductor. Wagner's own preoccupations with eros, death and violent destruction, are Dionysiac. His own music was consciously intoxicating, as I've mentioned. Recent critics have drawn attention to Wagner's extraordinary fetish for silks and satins, and indeed for cross-dressing, when at home and especially when composing. Once, when Nietzsche had been sent to buy silk underpants for Wagner, he met one of his students and, smiling, explained his anxiety at this task. Once you've chosen a god, you've got to adorn him. This fetish has, I suggest, less to do with Wagner's occasional erysipelas or supposed effeminacy than with Dionysus, who at times wore female garments. More unusual aspects of Wagner's eroticism, such as androgyny and homoeroticism, are core Dionysian attributes. So too is perfume, so necessary for Wagner's creativity, especially when writing Parsifal. Wagner approved of incest. He argued that the mother-son incest of Jocasta and Oedipus was not offensive because they had acted unconsciously according to the natural instinct of the purely human individual. Therefore, nature showed herself quite willing, blessing the union with 4 offspring. Approval of incest is Dionysiac, since Dionysus, like Siegfried, was born of incest. Occasionally, Wagner was explicit about his divinity. Following his abortive elopement with Jessie Loso in 1850, he wrote to a mutual friend that, "To the god of love we dedicated ourselves," and he lamented that Jessie had sacrificed her god to one of the idols of bourgeois hypocrisy. But only the year before, in his Fatherland speech in Dresden, Wagner had spoken, as it were, as the god of annihilation. "I will destroy this order of things, for it makes unhappy men of us all. I will shatter the power of the mighty of the law and property. Man's master shall be his own will, his own desire, his only law. I am revolution. I, the eternal destroyer. I am the ever-fashioning life. I am the only God who gives life and happiness to all that is." The god of love, the god of destruction, sensuality and cruelty combined. Only Dionysus was such a god. Now, here's perhaps an even more startling idea. It is possible that Wagner actually invokes the spirit of Dionysus in his late music dramas. In ancient Greece, the Maenads dedicated to Dionysus invoked the god by crying "Eoi, Eoi" to summon him. I boldly suggest that at key moments in Wagner's late music dramas, he invokes the god Dionysus, though the audience won't know it. The Valkyries famously shriek "Hoya to ho, hey aha," again and again, just before Brunhilde arrives with Sieglinde, who is pregnant with Siegfried. When Siegfried first enters with Dionysian violence, he cries out "Hoi ho, hoi ho." As he fashions the sword which will kill Mima, Siegfried repeatedly cries out "Ho ho, ho ho, hoi hey, ho ho." In Götterdämmerung, Siegfried's eventual murderer, Hagen, summons Siegfried by shouting "Hoi ho," a cry he repeats on significant occasions. In Tristan, and by the way, the shepherd is a key Dionysian theme. In Tristan, at key moments before Tristan and Isolde drink the love potion, sailors cry out 3 times "Ho hey ha hey." Extraordinarily, Parsifal opens with Gurnemanz calling "Hey ho." I argue that all of these are disguised ways of invoking the god Dionysus into the audience, into the German elite. Wagner wrote that his audience would be the congregation after the annihilation. He did not mean physical annihilation, but he did mean, I believe, his music's annihilation of intellect through feeling. More importantly, he knew from Feuerbach that through imagination and will, one can both create and destroy. For Feuerbach, total subjectivity brings omnipotence. I quote, "If total subjectivity is consecrated as the highest power and reality, it produces the ability to posit everything real as unreal, everything conceivable as possible, through the power of the imagination and the power of self-will. To posit the real as unreal. Did Wagner envisage a virtual annihilation, above all, of the Jewish God? In 1849, Wagner wrote in Artwork of the Future, the folk, and it is a bit difficult, but I hope you'll get the gist of his words, the folk only has to deny by deeds that thing, which is indeed no thing. Taught by instinct, the folk needs only to turn this non-willed thing into non-existence. By force of its own necessity, the folk will annihilate what is fit for nothing but annihilation, and then the something of the far future will stand before the folk. So I argue that Wagner's musical religion resurrected the dark ecstasy of the Greek Dionysia. It aimed at subliminally influencing the intoxicated audience, who were Germany's elite, into willing the non-existence of Orthodox Christianity, the Jewish God, and ultimately the Jews. In later years, my final paragraph, in later years, Wagner's family and disciples called him Master. After his death, Wagner's biographer Glasenapp wrote to another disciple that now they must become apostles. The Master's religion was intended to influence future Germany. His political journal, Bayreuth Leaves, 1878 to 1936, encapsulated his doctrine. Cosima Wagner wrote to Ludwig Schemann in October 1881, while Wagner is still alive, "Fortunately, what issues from Bayreuth is not merely a doctrine, but also instructions on how to put this doctrine into practice in every conceivable field. In the same way, our Saviour sacrificed himself so that his disciples should proclaim his message." Did Nazism put Wagner's doctrine and message into practice? That is one of the questions which Robert Wistrich will now answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for this extremely rich lecture, so vividly delivered, and with so much to think about. I hope that we will have some time to discuss these things, and some things which were really new to me, I must say, and I'm very grateful. And now we move to the third part of our evening, and this is the head of this center. Professor Robert Wistrich, I will say just a few words. It has a very long and very highly impressive resume. And just to tell you that he holds the Neuberger Chair of Modern European History at the university here. And he is awarded with so many different prizes. And recently, with a lifetime achievement by the Journal of the Study of Antisemitism, author of 29 books and some with international awards, as I mentioned, and also producer of several films. Very interesting. I suggest that you will see in his internet page. I just will mention that his work, newest book, is entitled From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and the Israel, published in 2012. And acclaimed by Jewish Ideas Daily as one of the best books of the year. In April 2013, just 2 months ago, Robert Wistrich was named as one of the 100 most positive influence on the Jewish world and Israel at a gala dinner at the Allgemeiner newspaper in New York. So I think, Robert, we can move to your presentation. and later on I will open the discussion to the floor.
For that introduction, and before I add my 20 minutes worth of reflections both on what we've just heard and on the broader question or challenge that was put at the end, let me first of all thank all my colleagues at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for once again having organized this evening efficiently and successfully. Let me thank Ruth for having agreed to preside over this evening's event, and in particular, Margaret Brearley. I would like just to mention briefly that our first encounter dates back approximately 25 years. At a time when I'd been commissioned to prepare a film documentary which eventually was called The Longest Hatred, which covered the 2,000-year history of anti-Semitism. This was a film I co-made with Rex Blumstein. And the first time I actually saw Margaret was on the 1-hour original version of the take which was made with her, in which the outstanding section was clearly on Richard Wagner. So that actually made it to the final cut of the film. But listening tonight to this tour de force, I can see just how much the themes that were already present there have been enriched. And a great deal of food for thought was provided for us tonight. Let me first say immediately that, as I put it a few days ago in an article called Wagner at 200, Richard Wagner clearly is not your run-of-the-mill, everyday kind of anti-Semite any more than he is your run-of-the-mill, however excellent composer and producer of operas or intellectual. Wagner knew very well, and I think that's already come out clearly this evening, that he was in numerous ways an exceptional being. Prophet, priest, composer extraordinary, inventor of virtually of a new, single-handedly of a new mode of music dramas in which sound and the written word were combined in original and pioneering ways. Not to mention the kind of torture with which he's put so many generations of audiences through, many of them being sufficiently masochistic, it would seem, that they're quite happy to sit through The Ring, just to take the most obvious example. I think that was unprecedented in the history of music, that somebody would have both the genius and the megalomania to actually write and conceive an opera that required 4 evenings and 15 hours altogether in order to be fully digested. So obviously we're talking about somebody who, as an artist, clearly believed in the monumental. When I come at the end of my remarks to parallels, elective affinities, and influences that Wagner and his legacy may have had on Nazism, I think that is one of the points that needs to be borne in mind. This combination of an appetite for the monumental in art, the overpowering, overpowering reason, as was said, but overpowering the senses as well. The whole notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk, of the total work of art, clearly involves that fusion of, and bombardment, in a way, of the audience by overpowering sense impressions, feelings. And Wagner was a master of that. Of course, no artist, neither in his own time or since, it seems to me, has aroused such intense controversy. We are speaking here tonight in Jerusalem, in the state of Israel, and I'm sure virtually everybody in this room knows that more or less once in a decade, a storm erupts. Perhaps it's dying down slowly now, but I remember when I first arrived in Israel as a new immigrant, a new Oleh, in 1981, more or less just over 30 years ago. I walked straight into my first great cultural storm in this country, which was when Zubin Mehta thought that he would actually be able to get away with conducting Wagner in public. And I was astounded to see the kind of vehement reactions and the scale of the snowballing effect of the controversy. And it's been repeated over a number of times, and every time that Daniel Barenboim attempted this, and others, the response has been by and large similar. Why, we might ask, if we don our rational cap, why this composer should arouse such tremendous resistance in Israel, given the fact that he died 50 years before the Nazis came to power in Germany. And similar responses, on the whole, have not occurred with regard to others who might be much more directly tainted with an association, both with the Third Reich and even with the death camps. And indeed, Israel Radio, I know, played a composer who was in very good standing in the Third Reich, Karl Orff, without arousing anything like these kind of responses. Richard Strauss was a bit different, but the ban on Richard Strauss was more or less laid aside in contrast to Wagner. And as one who has, over the last 30 years, taught almost every year a course on the history of anti-Semitism, obviously I have to, and always have, exposed my students to at least some of Wagner's writings, and from time to time extracts, not exactly the one we heard today, but others. So in academia, it would be absurd to apply any kind of boycott or ban on Wagner. It would be totally counterproductive and senseless. And indeed, I'm very happy we're talking about this openly this evening. Nevertheless, I know perfectly well, precisely because I've devoted a great deal of time and thought to the role of anti-Semitism in European culture, and more broadly, Wagner is a key figure, and many of the reasons have already been elaborated. I want to go back, though, to the seminal work, which was evoked already by Ruth in her introductory remarks, Das Judentum in der Musik, Jewry in Music, 1850, which Wagner did not attach his own name to. He actually used the pen name or pseudonym Freigedank, free thought. Only 1869 did he actually attach his name. It's striking, and I think Yaakov Katz, who was also mentioned, drew attention to this, that Wagner in this particular case was actually going against the current. In 1850, Germany, and indeed Europe, was not really ripe for the new kind, the new anti-Semitism, as you know, it's a fashionable phrase today, but racial anti-Semitism would have been considered the new anti-Semitism of that time. Germany was not ripe for it. Even in 1869, when Wagner added some material, but it's basically the same text, he was 10 years ahead of the organized anti-Semitic movement that would emerge in Berlin. So clearly, it could not have been opportunistic reasons. He had nothing to gain. On the contrary, he had a great deal to lose by going public with his thoughts about the Jews. And he, I think, recognized that in 1869 when it became widely known that he was the author of this text. I want to mention a few things in this work that haven't yet been stated because it seems to me they're very important in order to place Wagner in the history of anti-Semitism, and particularly in relation to the question of the Shoah. One of the innovations in that text is the use of the term in German Verjudung. In English, often translated as Jewification. They're different translations. It's an ugly word. You can take your pick. Wagner insists that German society and culture, and especially German music, has become Jewified. In 1850, there were two main examples. One he calls by name, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who had died 3 years earlier at a young age. The other, whom he does not name, but is clearly the prime target of his loathing, is Giacomo Meyerbeer. Meyerbeer was an immensely successful writer of operas, especially in Paris, which was the center of opera at that time, a place where Wagner knew a great deal of frustration, poverty, bitterness. He did not achieve the recognition he hoped for. Meyerbeer assisted him, was quite generous towards Wagner, and was rewarded with an extraordinarily vitriolic attack in which Meyerbeer becomes the representative, without being named, of all those negative, even demonic traits that Wagner projects on the Jews. The thing that strikes me the most in Wagner's claims about the Jews in music, it hasn't really been addressed, but in a way it's implied in things that have been said tonight, is the claim that Jews in music totally lack what Wagner sees as the prime quality of authenticity and genuine creativity. They lack passion, Leidenschaft. When he discusses Mendelssohn, and by the way, he never mentions that Mendelssohn is a Christian, because that clearly is not a criterion for Wagner. He treats him as a Jew who represents Jews in music. Mendelssohn, despite his talent, which Wagner acknowledges, despite his ability at times to move us, ultimately doesn't have that authentic quality that Wagner associates with genuine art. And he cannot have it There's a deterministic view here. The Jew, under no circumstances, in Wagner's perception of things, can create genuine art. Although the terminology of race is not used explicitly, it is implied insofar as Wagner is discussing, when he talks about Jews, as indeed when he talks about Germans and a number of other groups, he's discussing essences. There's a Jewish essence, and it's expressed in music and in other arts. And it's in the Jewish personality and the Volksgeist, the spirit of the people that was referred to previously. That is clearly a legacy of Romanticism. German Romanticism in this area was particularly influential. Somebody who very much loathed Wagner actually called him the last mushroom on the dung heap of Romanticism. The person who used that really offensive, I would say, description was Max Nordau. I mention that because Herzl was referred to, and Herzl indeed admired Wagner. And we know that Der Judenstaat, the text thanks to which at least some of us actually are in this room, if we look at the longue durée. Herzl wrote in his diaries when he was in Paris, "The only time I became uncertain about the correctness of my views regarding Zionism was when I did not have the opportunity to listen to Wagner's operas at the Paris Opera House." So Herzl felt inspired, and we could speculate later, I won't go into it now, what inspired him. Whereas Nordau, who was his right-hand man and the second most important figure in the Zionist movement at that time, thought that Wagner was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with modernity, with modern art, which in his book Degeneration, 1892, he characterized as a complete chaos of alarming symptoms of the decline of Western and European culture. And Wagner, for him, was a prime exhibit. Wagner was actually the source of everything that was wrong with modernism. And when he devotes half a page to Wagner and Wagnerism, in a book in which anti-Semitism barely appears, by the way, as a subject, Nordau fixes on something very interesting. He says that there is a combination in Wagner of a very Germanic kind of hysteria tied to a persecution complex in which the Germans believe they are being persecuted. And Wagner has a very intense persecution complex himself. On top of being a megalomaniac and a graphomaniac, the anti-Semitism not mentioned directly, but it's implied that it comes from this persecution complex. And that he's expressing something deep in the German psyche at that time. The Germans, and what Wagner is drawing on, is in effect the belief that they are being oppressed, dominated, controlled, manipulated by Jews. And of course, in that book, Das Judentum, or that pamphlet, perhaps, Das Judentum in der Musik, one of the prime points right at the beginning is the issue of Jewish emancipation, which is on the agenda at that time in Germany, because the Jews are not emancipated yet. Wagner turns it round. We need to be emancipated from the Jews. We need to conduct a war of liberation against the Jews, to free the German soul, German art, German culture, German society. Which, of course, immediately leads you to understand why someone like Joseph Goebbels, who was not only Minister of Propaganda, but also, if you like, the Commissar of Culture in the Third Reich, why Goebbels could say that we learned everything that we know about the Jew from Richard Wagner. But this brings me to Hitler. A few facts which are well known, but it's worth recalling them. First of all, already at the age of 12, the young Hitler heard his first Wagner opera in Linz, in the Upper Austrian city of Linz. That was in 1901. He spoke about it having an overpowering effect. We know that again in Linz in 1906, when he was 17 years old, he heard or he saw the performance of Rienzi, which again struck him, and many years later he told his boyhood friend, who also recounts this, Kubitschek, that's where it all began, when we together, they listened to this Wagner opera, almost the very first, certainly the first that had any success, was Rienzi. It's very different really from everything else. I don't know how proud really Wagner was of it, but it's a story of a popular Roman tribune who's ultimately defeated, but clearly there's a political message that was instantly perceived by Hitler as perhaps pointing to a future of arousing, in this case, the German masses, not medieval context of the opera. There's a question among historians how central a source were Wagner's writings, his political writings, his writings on culture, which, as was pointed out, were extraordinarily voluminous. I don't believe that in the history of music there's anyone that approaches the scale of these essays and writings on opera, on music, on culture, on social, political issues. Thomas Mann, of course, could say rather casually that none of it was worth reading. And no doubt he didn't read it. But I'm not so sure he was right. I think that was quite a mistake. That's been continued by a number of historians since then, and certainly Wagner lovers, because it's a prime part of the apologia for Wagner when we say we have to completely separate the person from the art. Wagner was a bad person, but a genius. Well, yes, those statements are true. He was a philanderer, he was a sponger, he ruthlessly used people, including those who were ready to sacrifice everything for him, including not a small number of Jews, it should be mentioned. Because for such a virulent anti-Semite, it is striking that in his entourage, there were all these Jews who were passionate lovers of Wagner, willing to do anything. Joseph Rubinstein and Heinrich Polges And of course, the conductor of the premiere of Parsifal, Hermann Levy, whom Peter Gay described as a prime exhibit in the history of Jewish self-hatred. Levy wrote to his father, was a rabbi, wrote to his father, Wagner is not the kind of anti-Semite, low grade. He's not low grade. It's noble, it's idealistic. Levy could actually, as long as he wasn't being on the receiving end of insults, he could empathize with it. He wasn't the only one. The man who made Wagner famous, the impresario, was Angelo Neumann. Wagner, a year before his death, this recorded in the diaries, makes the comment, isn't it odd, that it's a Jew who's putting my name in lights. Of course, he was famous already, but Angelo Neumann did everything that you could imagine an agent, a PR man, to do. And many of the people in Wagner's audiences, especially in Germany, and no doubt in Austria and elsewhere, were Jews. This is a fact. It was sufficiently well known that such a prominent German Jewish writer as Bertolt Aubach, in an unpublished manuscript in 1881, most of it he consecrates to this phenomenon, that Jews are among the leading Wagner lovers, Wagnerites. They're sitting often in the front row, and they're in their tuxedos, and they adore Wagner. And this has carried on, not in Israel, but it's carried on in many places. I was present at a debate about 15, 16 years ago, it seems to me, at Columbia University. Very embarrassing. Between Edward Said, the late Edward Said, the Palestinian intellectual, and professor of English literature, and also a musicologist, if I'm not mistaken,
yes.
who wrote a lot about music.
He did.
He had a feeling for it. He was a connoisseur. And Daniel Barenboim. And one of the extraordinary things was, Barenboim was saying, okay, I only consider the art, which is transcendental, which is, if you like, divine. Wagner carried it out, carried it off, semi-divine. And all the rest, at the end of the day, is secondary or unimportant. Even Said was embarrassed. He didn't quite know what to do with it. That was a bit too far for him, although in another context, over the issue of why Wagner is banned in Israel, of course, he got his own money's worth of sticking it to the Jewish state over that. But he was embarrassed on that occasion. And now I come to the central point, and I'll be brief. What is, in fact, the connection, or what do we need to be mindful of in the relationship between Wagner and Hitler, despite the fact that Wagner is dead 6 years before Hitler is born? I think there are several things. Undoubtedly, this world of Germanic myth, that Wagner was the first composer to revive in such a way this whole world of the Germanic and Nordic sagas, the wars, the battles between these titanic gods, who, as was explained from Wagner's perspective, they were really, ultimately in their essence, they were reflections of the Germans themselves and the possibilities of their self-deification. All of that obviously appealed to Hitler. It was a world he could escape to. That's one element. One of his closest party comrades, who was a very good pianist, Hempfstenkel, who was educated in Harvard, he said the only way he could get Hitler to calm down, to relax, was by playing prelude or some piece of Wagner's music. It would be transfixed, like entering a trance. And this we have from so many different sources for so many different people. This hypnotic, narcotic effect, the very thing that Nietzsche, when he turned against Wagner, contra Wagner, denounces. Wagner est une névrose. That's written in French in one of Nietzsche's passages. Wagner is a neurosis. He's the German neurosis. You want to find your way into the neurotic core of the German soul, you have to know Wagner. And Hitler said, if you want to know National Socialism, you have to know Wagner. I would say there are two things. One concerns the Jews, one does not. The element which is more general is, I think, that the orchestration of the Nazi movement, which was very effective, which was one of the reasons why it achieved what it did politically, owes quite a lot to those techniques already pioneered in Bayreuth of staging and creating an atmosphere of unison, of intoxication, of noise, of parading. I mean, that's a lot of what went on in the Third Reich outwardly was all about that. And you could say at that level that the Nazi orchestration of public life was a kind of Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk in a perverted way, but not totally divorced from the source. With regard to the Jews, there are two remarks, because there's this debate over Untergang. And it's not only in that text. All the last writings of Wagner, which are a blend of social Darwinism, racism à la Gobineau, but full of anti-Semitism, Herodom and Christianity, to name one of them, or Know Yourselves, Erkenne dich selbst. We see that really the implication of what Wagner is saying is that Germany cannot be redeemed without the removal, certainly not explicit in terms of extermination, physical removal, but in many ways sinister, more striking in its ominous tone, potentially, than a lot of the anti-Semitic writings that were rampant, widespread at that time. That is something that it's impossible to miss, and precisely because of what was pointed out very strongly in Margaret's lecture, that it has this dimension of a musical religion, a substitute for an insight that Nietzsche himself pointed out, that in the modern world, with the withering of religion, at least as it looked from that time in the 19th century, art itself becomes the substitute religion. And Wagner turned that religion into a almost salvationist, messianic message that seemed to be waiting for someone to pick it up in the way that eventually, in a horrible way, Hitler picked it up and transformed it. And yet so many people at the time, including members of the cultural elite in Germany and to a degree elsewhere, recognized and were willing to play along with it. Thank you.
Okay. So we decided it's already 8:24, but we will have another 20 minutes. I have several comments myself on that which has been said, but I think that at this point, after you were such an obedient audience, that you should express your own comments and reactions, maybe thoughts that you brought with you from home into this evening, very, very rich evening. And I'm sure that people are full of all kinds of ideas and thought. And if I have time, I would like to say several things. But I will give you first. No. First the audience, and then I will come to myself. So please, if anybody wants to, please, yes.
How do you explain the current revival of Wagner's work that we see now in Europe,
yes,
and the way that the people are trying to erase all these Nazi and anti-Semitic
Okay, I think it's a very good question. I want to refer to this, or maybe you want as well. But maybe we'll collect another 1 or 2 questions, and then we will discuss this. Anybody? Yes.
I just like it's remark. Just repeat the questions because you're not here then.
Okay. So this lady, she asked, how are we explaining the present revival of Wagnerism in Europe at the moment? That everywhere in all the opera houses, if you open Mezzo in the television, you see Wagner everywhere. So how now, in the second decade, indeed 200 years after Wagner's birth, it's played everywhere, also in New York and the entire Ring and all these things. This really calls for explanation. So that was the question. So maybe, yes, please.
I'd like to hear a bit more about Bayreuth as Hitler's finishing school.
Yes.
I've heard something from Margaret in England on the subject, but I'm very interested in that and how familiar the world is with that relationship between Hitler, the rough youth, and Hitler, the refined leader, which came about as a result of Swansea Bible. The other thing I'm actually interested in unraveling, which came tonight as an idea for the first time, is what you're saying, either of the speakers really, when you talk about Jews and Wagner, is what was going on, that they were demonstrating not only of the music but of his philosophy, and that they were trying to assimilate themselves in accordance with his views. And did they see this as something which was just a neutral activity in the same way that assimilation is seen worldwide? I mean, I don't know which of the speakers would like to address that. I've also had a speaker in London to some degree about assimilation in the last 20 years.
Okay. Just another question. Maybe we will refer to this. Yes. One more question, and then we will refer to also 2 people here who'd like to ask. Yes.
I want to ask about this idea of annihilation, which Margaret mentioned. And I mean, in her talk, there was a clear thing of annihilation of the intellect, so that feeling takes over, annihilation of Western culture, of the whole of Western civilization, to create a new religion and a new humanity. And I'm wondering if there was a link with Eastern ideas about nothingness, yes. So that the thing becomes no thing. It sounds, you know, and the Indian philosophy was mentioned. And if Margaret could say more about the link there, if there is one.
Okay. I see that there are other two questions. If you can be very brief, and then we will start to discuss these.
The answer should be brief.
That's another question. Yes.
Professor Wistrich mentioned the fact that when Wagner wrote his Antisemitic piece, it was against the trend at this time. My question is, did his music change the trend in public opinion?
Good. Short and however powerful. Yes. Never.
I just thought about Emil Nolde, the artist who's a Nazi, but was definitely adopted by, for example, the Israel Museum, which made much of his art and covered up his Nazi leanings, and not only leanings. And the same is true of Karl Orff, who you can hear Bacola Musica.
Yes, it was mentioned. Yes. Yeah. Good. So I think that we will start answering this. Pick your questions that you would like to reply, and then if there's time, I will say a few things. So Margaret, please. Sure. Please.
Sorry, I read yes, revival of Wagnerism today. A, bicentenary. B, the kosherring of Wagner by Bayreuth, and that's Gottfried Wagner's term, the great-grandson of Richard Wagner. Bayreuth has done everything it can to make Wagner respectable, has de-emphasized the anti-Semitism, and quite widely, Wagner is considered as the composer for the 21st century. His spirituality is fuzzy, anti-intellectual, extremely powerful, and therefore he fits in with a sort of a post-traditional orthodox, comfy though uncomfortable spirituality. Did Jews become Wagnerians? Why? Yes, they did. Joseph Rubinstein, I think, described himself as having become a Kundry. He too could escape from his Jewish identity by becoming a Wagnerian, and immediately gain a cachet. It was a genuine, sort of becoming a follower of this incredible, powerful man, and it allowed Jews to escape all of the torment of being a Jew in the 19th century. Annihilation, yes, there is indeed a Schopenhauerian element. I left it out because because of time. But the annihilation from something into no thing is definitely Schopenhauerian, and Wagner found those ideas not only in Feuerbach but also Schopenhauer. It is certainly part of the Eastern mysticism that he adopted. Bayreuth is finishing school. That's fascinating. Hitler met the elite of Germany. He went to Bayreuth, first of all, on 1st of October 1923, just before the putsch. He met the Bechsteins, the Lehmanns, lots of others. They did indeed. They believed that he was the prophet foretold by Wagner, who, since Stuart Chamberlain, gave him, as it were, the master's blessing. And the links then between Hitler and Bayreuth were enormous. He wrote the Mein Kampf on paper supplied by Bayreuth. Winifred edited the proofs of Mein Kampf. There are lots of subtle references to Wagner in Mein Kampf, in the text of Mein Kampf, and right the way through. He actually created stage plans for Parsifal. He was involved in the Bayreuth productions right the way through the 30s and into the 40s. Bayreuth for him was the spiritual center of Nazism. to an extraordinary degree. And from the mid-20s, the leading Nazis went to Bayreuth, listened to Wagner's operas, and in the spirit of the master, went off and took core political decisions. Bayreuth cannot be overestimated, in my opinion, in its influence.
Could you help us in the other direction? We hear about Wagner influencing Hitler, but can you talk about, and his followers, but can you tell us something about that civilizing influence on Hitler of that place? I mean, he changed as a person, didn't he?
Well, he didn't change as a person, but he became more salonfähig. He was taught how to eat better, how to wear dinner jackets, how to mix in society, how to develop a slightly more sophisticated conversation. And by leading Wagnerians. That was part of the whole Bayreuth ethos, but we want to hear from Robert Wistrich. Thank you.
Okay, let me leap straight into that question about Bayreuth. Allusion was made, quite rightly, to Houston Stewart Chamberlain, this eccentric tutor maniac Englishman who then wrote a classic work, very anti-Semitic and racist, The Foundations of the 19th Century, that influenced Kaiser Wilhelm, influenced Hitler himself. Chamberlain married Wagner's daughter, Eva. He became the guru of Bayreuth at the beginning of the 20th century. And when indeed Hitler went just before the putsch to Bayreuth, and the aging Chamberlain, who had only a few years to live, gave his blessing, his hechsher, his stamp, on this 34-year-old Hitler, who was still a marginal figure to a certain degree in Germany, was not a great name, you know, it was before the putsch. He hailed him as the prophet redeemer that Germany had been waiting for, and that the master of Bayreuth, in fact, would have, you know, anticipated. And Chamberlain was an out-and-out Wagnerite who had written a completely misleading hagiographical biography of Wagner. Equally to be mentioned is another English person, English woman, Winfried Wagner, who had married Siegfried, the son of Richard. So she was Wagner's daughter-in-law, and she became the master of ceremonies at Bayreuth through the years of the Third Reich. And there were even rumors maybe Hitler had an affair with her and so on. I won't go into that. What is true, and this we have from Hitler himself and others, is that those experiences each year when he went to the Bayreuth festival were the happiest moments of his life. That was his family that he never had, basically. The boys, you know, Winfried's sons, they recalled that Hitler was Uncle Wolf for them. There's a human side that they actually genuinely believed in, and he seemed to be relaxed. He seemed to be almost like a normal human being, briefly, in that context. So that is important to know. Winifred, is that the way? Winifred, who was Welsh, I think. Yes, Welsh. Winifred later continued to exercise in the post-war era quite a lot of influence. She was an absolutely unregenerate Nazi who clung with nostalgia to the great days of the Bayreuth Festival in the Nazi era. And I was still living in England when, I think it was in 1976, there was a long interview that appeared on BBC television that had been conducted by Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg, probably the last neo-romantic of the German cinema, also an anti-Semite, by the way, that came out later. But he interviewed Winfried, and in that interview, she exposed herself. It was a very long interview. in describing Hitler as this enchanting, so well-mannered, you know, Austrian gentleman, kissed in hand, you know, Austrian-style gallantry towards women in particular, and what a wonderful person he was. And she clung to her Nazi beliefs, despite what she already knew. I mean, this is 1976. So this tells you how strong, at least for some of the clan, the Wagner clan, I mean, Gottfried Wagner has been waging a war of his own as the black sheep of that family ever since. So that's an important thing. One other point, because I can't take up all those questions, but one other point, which is not easy to answer, because it belongs definitely to the history of assimilation. Why would Jews be such enthusiastic Wagnerites and carry the torch for Wagner? I think part of the reason has actually been given, but perhaps precisely because in that 19th century German and Middle European environment, where art was becoming increasingly what I referred to before as the religion of the age. It was both the thing to do, it had a certain attraction because it was fashionable, it was chic, it was maybe a little frisson as well, because Wagner, as we've seen, is so ambiguous in so many areas, and you can interpret it in so many ways, the multi-layered thing, it's all true. And Jews who genuinely admired it, perhaps there's something else, it's only a speculation, I throw it out as an idea. There's something about the story of Richard Wagner. You could see it as a paradigm, even in such a conservative, hierarchical society like Germany was, of the self-made man. I mean, it's a spectacular rise out of nothing. And you know, Germany's never been a rags to riches society, and Wagner didn't become a millionaire. But nevertheless, this was a stupendous achievement, putting aside all the monstrosities of Wagner, which I'm well aware of. But it was a stupendous achievement. And maybe for Jews, who after all, with all the disabilities, all the fact, you know, they weren't even emancipated till 1871, fully, or 1870, maybe there could be an element on top of the other things, and genuine admiration, and perhaps this blind spot that Jews have had regarding anti-Semitism that still goes on, I have to say. Thank you.
If I may, I will add another two comments to the discussion. They can be quite long, but I will try to make them as short as I can. One has to do with interpretation, and the other has to do with what I called already in the beginning of this evening, the music libel against the Jews, about which I wrote. Interpretation. And this relates to the question of why the 21st century is so, again, reviving this kind of Wagnerian spirit and performance and everything. And to Daniel Barenboim's own cult, which I know from quite close. It has to do with the fact that music, that's something that one should bear in mind. I'm a musicologist, after all. That music is maybe the most open art to interpretation. And interpretation to semiotically, music is a very open sort of text, if we can call it this way. That's, for example, to give you just a very good and succinct example, that when Charlie Chaplin is producing his masterpiece, the Great Dictator, sure, the Great Dictator. There is a moment, maybe you remember this, when Hinkel, which is of course the kind of figure of Hitler, is toying with the idea of he's becoming the world redeemer or whatever, and then the whole world will come under his feet. He is there is a balloon which is kind of closed, and he's playing with it. And while he's doing it, we hear music, and the music is the opening, the overture of Wagner's Lohengrin. And of course, the way that Chaplin, who was such a good musician himself, is playing with it, is to tell us of course, to ridicule Hitler and the whole Wagnerian cult by saying to us that this is the subjectivity of this sort of leader, that which brings him to this sort of ideas and so on and so forth. So this is something that we can accept, and it's very much in the spirit of what has been said so far this evening. And if we are continuing with this a little bit more, in the movie itself, Chaplin is later on making something which is quite surprising. The very end of the film, if you remember, and it has to do with the fact that it's the same Chaplin which is playing both figures, Hinkel as well as the Jewish barber. And the Jewish barber, as you recall, is the person who is, when the whole thing is approaching towards the end, he is redeeming Germany from Hitler and from Nazism by the fact that he looks so similar to that, to the Führer. And he is then coming and delivering his the kind of speech that everybody expecting in the Anschluss Vienna. Yes, it's about to be 1938 in the fictional world of the movie. And he's delivering this, and of course the kind of the speech that he's delivering is a very positive, liberal, American, if you want, sort of speech. And while he's delivering his speech, his girlfriend, Hannah, was on the airs after the Nazi bullies that are stamping on her and so on. She's as if hearing his voice, and from within the clouds up there, we hear music. And lo and behold, the music is, again, Wagner's Lohengrin. So, what does it mean? It means that indeed the same sort of music. Music is indeed open, and this is part of the irony of music, that you can take it into different things because unto itself it does not say what it is about. Only when there are words, and also the words, as you know, can be interpreted in very different ways. And there is so much in Wagner, I can tell you, that can be interpreted in so many different ways, and people did interpret it in different ways. Already in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and later on, Donington was mentioned here, and the all Jungian interpretation. Bernard Shaw, and the way that he interpreted the Ring in terms of the socialist movement, and many other things. So this is very much the fact that also today it can be so interpreted, and it is being interpreted in this way. And you can see it, and there is so much things that later on was taken in this spirit by many different artists, writers, musicians, and so on, including Thomas Mann that was mentioned. So this is one comment. The other one has to do with, as I said, the music libel against the Jews. And it has to do also with the controversy or the way that Wagner attacked, as has been said, Meyerbeer in his Diskussion der Musik. What was indeed the issue between Wagner and Meyerbeer, the way that I see it? Meyerbeer was so modern in his operas, the kind of grand opera that he wrote when he was such a really an immensely important composer in Paris in the 40s and 50s. What was the new thing about that music? It was the fact that it was deviating from the harmonious paradigm that was so strong in Western music since the time of the Greeks, that, as we have heard, was so important for the Wagnerian worldview by and large. When I'm saying that it was different from that, I mean that through the ages there were so many different variations of this myth, but the idea was that music should always drive us into something which will bring the world into a certain kind of harmony. that it works on harmony, it relates to the harmony of the sphere, all kinds of different harmonies, but it should harmonize. And that was very important. And in relation to this, and something that I wrote about, the Jew was always a noise. It was not something that Wagner invented. It goes back to the Middle Ages, to certain libel that was indeed there from the 12th century, at least. And these new Jews that were looked like you and me, as Balzac said, like Meyerbeer, like Mendelssohn, like Heine, like many others at that age, they had new ideas about culture, not all of them. Mendelssohn was a little bit different, but Meyerbeer did not hesitate for the first time, in that sense it was really modern, to break apart from this sort of holism. And his operas are ending with certain kind of disruption and destruction of society and culture and things like that. Like, for example, in the Prophet, the Prophet, the opera that Wagner heard just before he conceived this work, the Studentum der Musik. And he couldn't stand. There is those things that he wrote later on in Mein Leben, his autobiography. How debilitating, how devastating was this experience for him as he wrote. He went on in the middle of the opera because he couldn't stand this sort of something which is not so simultaneous and coherent and bringing you to this sort of redemption that everybody should cohere in, except of indeed the Jews and those who are built on his model, on his archetype, like Beckmesser in the mighty thing that I mentioned beforehand. So that was part of the whole thing, and that's why it so could deeply engage German and beyond Germany, other Christian audiences throughout Europe and beyond that even. There is much to be said about this as well, what it means that the Jews, were they indeed embodied in his work or not. There is also a controversy on that. But I think that we heard so much in this evening. And there is, and I just want to thank this two marvelous speakers, and I call you to join me in the crowd.